We're live. I love how I love how it tells you you're live in like the most uncertain terms. StreamYard, it's like encouraging. It's like you can do it. You're live. It's Mind Your Banners. This is Wednesday, June 24th, 2026. I'm Zach Osterman. He's Mike Niziolek, as always. First, an apology. We haven't done one of these in a while. Mike and I were talking a little bit off air about my adult tonsillectomy experience. It's a long story, and I won't give anyone the gory details, but I had my tonsils removed a couple weeks ago, and needless to say, I've been down bad for most of the last 2 weeks. And then before that, we had some various vacations and things, off-season things that happen that get in the way. But I promise we will have more Mind Your Banners content for you, and more content just on the YouTube channel in general for you across the course of the rest of the summer as we build toward football season, as we build toward Big Ten Media Days. There's always enough going on to talk about, and no one better to talk about it with than my good friend Mike Niziolek. Mike, how are you?
Better than you. So I guess
I mean, I'm like I would describe myself as like 88%.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean the voice is mostly back.
It's very worse.
The mornings are the worst because you dry out overnight, and then like you have to like kind of rehydrate everything in the morning. And yeah, but it's I mean, like I'm back to eating like most meals. I have developed an affinity for your beloved protein shakes.
Oh yeah, they're good.
Did
you do the Fairlife?
No, I did muscle milk, and then a little
muscle milk. Because if you're doing muscle milk, like you have not lived yet, because that tastes like gross. But Fairlife is very good.
I threw in a little bit of Oikos at the end, mostly because I couldn't find any muscle milk at Target. So I went to Sam's before this, and I like just loaded up on like popsicles and muscle milk and Gatorade, and then I ran out of all of it. So you know, we had to restock, but we're not here to talk about my tonsils or the artists formerly known as my tonsils. We are here to talk about Indiana athletics. And Mike, we're here to talk about something genuinely exciting, something that you and I will lead with this today, just because we made the announcement this morning. Something you and I know have been anxious to talk about more publicly for some time. Anyone who's talked with us in the last 2 or 3 months, we've hardly kept it a secret that we were writing a book about Indiana football's journey across the last really 2.5 years. Certainly, you know, focusing heavily on the 2025 season and the 2026 national championship run, but trying to, you know, I saw someone asked you on social media, it's not just a game by game breakdown. This is an attempt to capture some historical perspective, to tell the stories of some of the key characters involved, of course, not least Curt Cignetti. Unthinkable to Unstoppable is the name of the book. The full name, if folks want it, I should have had this ready when I was when we started. Unthinkable to Unstoppable, how Curt Cignetti and the Indiana Hoosiers stunned college football. It is out September 22nd. You can pre-order now wherever you buy your books: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Walmart, and so forth. You know, check my bio on Twitter, check Mike's bio on Twitter. We've got links to all that stuff. And Mike, I mean, the exciting thing more than anything else is we just get to talk about this in public now because it's out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's even been longer than making. I was just on Corey and Company, and when I was talking, he said, "When did you guys decide?" And I said, you know, because I proposed it to you, you know, in 24. And obviously the way the book industry works, very quick turnaround, and it just sort of didn't, we sort of kicked it around and didn't act fast enough because, you know, we handed in the full manuscript on May 2nd. And so, but, you know, once it had to be done. I mean, obviously in the 25 season, I don't know what the moment you said, but I said by Ohio State, we were sort of locked in.
That was when it felt like, yeah, I think that night we said something like,
this is because at that point, even if they had lost in the first round of the playoff, it was still a worthy.
Not that anyone expected them to, obviously. No one expected them to lose that game against against lowly Alabama.
But my point is they by beating Ohio State, winning the Big Ten, that there was a natural endpoint, even if the playoff didn't go with the way they wanted. And obviously they did and won everything, and so like it became even more. But like, yeah, we had added in our mind, and it ended up the process was really fun to sort of dive in and do these interviews with all these people and tell their story.
And to be clear, wherever we could, and for the most part, there are some pieces where this doesn't line up or whatever, but wherever we could, we re-reported this. And that's not to say we didn't draw on some old reporting or just even our own experiences, what we saw when we were covering these games and these stories across not just 2025 into 26, but 2024 and I know you kind of joked that at one point that like the chapters about IU's history were sort of like my baby because of just like how
you were here when they last
yes.
So
Yes,
like
exactly.
you were
I was on the bus for the 45 national championship or for a 45 Big Ten championship, but
you faced down Captain Teeters.
Yeah.
And lived to tell the tale.
There's an Easter egg in one of the Purdue chapters for you. But number one, I would say this in a twofold way. Number one, where possible, we re-reported as much of this as we could. And number two, and this is where we are so grateful, so many people were willing to give their time and their recollections. And I don't want to spoil like too many of the fun anecdotes and things. We want people to buy the book and read the book, and believe me, there'll be more promotion to come. So I'm not trying to be evasive or vague, but one of the things that when people ask me, people who knew that we were working on this book asked me sort of like did what surprised me or excited me or what what did I sort of enjoy most of the process. One of the things I did was how many great stories we got from people pretty much unprompted, including stories that one or both of us had maybe heard through the course of one of these seasons, but not been able to get confirmed because while the season's going on, there's the sanctity of the locker room and, things are moving at a certain pace and you just kind of can't, you can't always keep up with it. But, the number of times that even unprompted, someone would share just like a great story. And there are too many people for me to start thanking them now because I'm going to forget somebody if I do, but there were so many people that gave their time, that gave, their recollections, their memories, their insight, their context, their perspective. Like it was incredibly rewarding, but also I was incredible, and I think I speak for you as well. I was incredibly appreciative of just how many people were willing to sort of sit down and walk back through that experience with us. Because listen, I know this, for a lot of these people, it's going to be one of the greatest sort of accomplishments of their lives. I get that, but it's not like people aren't busy. We talk to guys who were in NFL training camps. We talk to people who were, who could have easily given us reasons to say, hey, listen, I'm sorry, I just don't think I can do this right now. And yet they made all that time.
I think it speaks to how important the story is this is their story, right? And so I think they were excited to talk about it and in a context of, like you said, free from the stress of the season, free from the sort of the pressures, not in sort of like a locker room setting or a post press conference setting. Like you get to sort of sit back and sit and kind of think about, and I think, we tried to ask questions that weren't asked. We tried to ask them from a different angle. And one of the sort of examples I gave earlier today, when you talk about reporting, because I think it's about 95%, if we're doing a percentage, like fresh reporting, like we hit on the big moments, right? Like, so like the Purdue sucks moment.
Right. Like the score of the Oregon game didn't change, but like we got a lot of depth.
But my point with this one specifically was like we had talked about we had done reporting on the Purdue sucks and got the reaction of it even in the moment, but we talked to more people about that than I think maybe like that made the book. We talked to most people about it, but we like made the book like 15 to 20 different sort of perspectives, sort of everybody that was in the building, and like everybody had sort of like a great story or a great reaction to it, and sort of like you're like, yes, that moment, but maybe not from this angle. And so, that was one of the things I was excited about with the book is that we did, I don't know if you mentioned the number, like 7 interviews, I think about 40 players from 24, 25, obviously administrators, coaches, personalities, all that to sort of try to, because I think during the season, like, our reporting's good. Like, I think we met the moment, we told great stories, but like when we thought about trying to get people to buy a book, we wanted to sort of, give them some value to it. And I think we did. And so it's all, it's not just a game by game recap. It is fresh. But we should point out that the Indy Star and HT did put out a lovely compilation of that reporting and those game by game recaps in hardcover form. Perfect, I believe, is the title. You can order that where books are sold as well. But so we wanted to sort of go beyond that and do something different and delineate it. And I think we did. And we're really excited to sort of, like you said, talk about it, share it, have people read it, and dive into sort of those stories.
And I think that, you talked about like it is the story. It is a story that will follow so many of these people, and I mean this in the best way possible, for the rest of their lives. And someone asked, Terry Davis asked here, did you interview Don Fisher? Not only did we interview Don was kind enough to contribute the foreword for the book. So Don actually wrote the foreword to the book, as well as sitting with us, I think, for more than an hour, just for his perspective on both the history around the program and also what it was like to live that, what it meant to Indiana and its fans, all those sorts of things. Like you said, I too stand by the idea that what we reported when we reported it was really, really good. And what we wrote when we wrote it was really, really good. But you don't know how the story is going to end in the middle of it. And when you're in the middle of it, what you see are, to lean on the old cliche, are the trees. You see, the literal sort of D'Angelo Pons read Dante Moore's eyes and picked him off and ran into the end zone. You don't see what that moment maybe says to college football about Indiana, its program, its fans. You can't maybe, one of the things that I felt like the book really did, the more we pieced it together, was really contextualize how important, and I think this is something in fact, I know this is something Curt Cignetti brought up at the end of the 2025 season, was how important the 2024 season was. And he went out of his way, I think more than once, to say that he did not think that Indiana's 2024 team got enough credit for its part in what happens in 2024 and then through 2025 and into winning the national championship in January of 26. The book, I fervently believe, and I certainly hope when people read it, they feel the same way. It captures a greater perspective of, why does Curt Cignetti's process work so well? What are we consider, and we can say, yeah, his process works. Well, what is that process? Why does it work? It's not like other people aren't trying. How did it manifest itself in this moment or this moment or this moment? It just gathers a level of perspective that I think we all have, at least to some extent. But in the moment, you can't see everything. All you can see are pieces. And what I fervently hope as people read this book is that they feel it fits all those pieces together and then really adds great depth basically every step of the way as it does that, because again, we were able to talk to a lot of these people when not just after they'd been removed from it, but also when they'd had some time themselves to reflect on what it meant and what they'd accomplished. And there was even maybe a deeper sense of perspective from the point of view of a Pat Coogan or, a Riley Nowakowski or, whoever, to be able to reflect back and really see that whole picture and comment on that whole picture themselves.
Well, I'd be remiss. I mean, we got lucky in the sense that not all national. I mean, look, not all national title winners are equal, and obviously Indiana's story is probably greater than most, especially when it's your first and from losing his program. But like the personalities on this team, like not just like the players, parents, Curt Cignetti, obviously, made it, like you didn't have to work hard, right? To get like Pat Coogan, like, I mean, is probably one of the all-time players I've covered in terms of not media savvy is not the right word, just like in terms of just always having a good quote and having sort of like this mature perspective. But like, I mean, it was great to sort of just have sort of this wealth of characters to sort of draw from. They talk about like this being a movie, but like, I mean, really, like, yeah, I mean, you're talking sort of just in terms of a reporter, you're sort of gifted with all these personalities, and guys that were very mature beyond their years. Like Aiden Fisher was always great with us. Riley Nokowski, was fantastic, and so that made it easy to sort of, I think, in the writing process, just because you had not only guys that just would give good quotes, but were just colorful, right? And had sort of lived lives and had these great stories. And so I think that sort of added to it, that it just wasn't, Curt Cignetti is obviously a dominant sort of force throughout the book, but he's not the only sort of colorful personality that we got to sort of highlight and talk about.
I mean, anything else you want to share on the? We're going to talk.
Bother you as you're again back to mid-season.
I'm responding to people asking questions about the book.
Typing a recipe, or like I don't even know, ordering.
I'm only getting my sense of taste back like yesterday and today. So recipes aren't even that interesting to me yet. I was responding to a question from someone who had a question about ordering the book. Forgive me. I'm sorry.
Sure. I mean, could wait till after the podcast.
I'm about immediate customer service here, my man. I'm a multitasker. But no, seriously. And we'll talk more about it as time goes on. And I know both the Star and the Herald Times have been very generous that, they'll run some excerpts as we get closer to pre-order, and we'll talk more about it too, just as we get closer to college football season. I was quietly delighted when we got the release date, which is September 22nd, because that is specifically the week of Indiana's Big Ten opener. So it is timed really well for the sort of ramping up of course, another season that Indiana fans hope is going to be a really successful one. And we are already working I had a couple questions about this earlier today. We're already working as well on some public events around the release of the book, probably in Bloomington, I would imagine, in Indianapolis as well. And we will have more details on those as we go. But we've just, this again, we spent, I forget the date that we did our first one of these. It was sometime in like early mid-February.
Like interview, you mean?
Yeah, first interview. I think it might have been with Andrew Turvey. I think it was.
I think Andrew Turvey was first.
I think Andrew, either that or Jeremy Gray, who Indiana fans will know as a jack of many, many trades within the IU athletics department. But this was a months-long process for us of reporting and writing and editing. Mike was working on this when he was in Vegas. I was working on this from a hotel room at Disney World. I think the only time I tapped out was when I was on like weapons grade Tylenol after my surgery. So, we have been really excited to get to a place where we could talk about this more openly and more publicly. Again, I'll make sure to include a link in the caption on YouTube, but it's out September 22nd, Unthinkable to Unstoppable. You can pre-order it on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble, on Walmart. I've actually, and I will freely admit that this is patting both of us on the back, but I'm happy to do it today. I've already had friends who have screen grabbed me from each of Amazon, Walmart, and Barnes and Noble. So we are spreading. We're spreading.
Just testing everything. Testing they might all work. And so
yes, exactly.
Commerce is live and well. Daniel, we could do an event in Atlanta. Reconnect with Daniel Flick. That'd be fun, right? Your hometown.
You didn't take them to Disneyland? My kids went to Disneyland.
No, Josh, a fellow reporter on the beat at the time. He's since departed. Just gone. Disappeared. He's been banished. Promised Disneyland tickets and said he had a hookup and said he had a connect. And so we were all like, well, we'll go, because it was a pricey, because we were in We were in for basketball. We're covering, obviously USC and UCLA. So quite a hike to Anaheim. So we drive down there, pay for parking. If Josh got these tickets, promised him even on the trip, I got this. Did not deliver, and in shame left. Could not stay in Bloomington anymore because of the shame he just in failing. It was sad, really. A downer.
One last one here on I guess this is one of those teases. Forgive me, but Terry said, did you ask any of the transfers like Riley Nowakowski if they wish they'd chosen Indiana originally? We didn't. I think you're going to be surprised at the number of 1- and 2-year Hoosiers that really still learn to embrace the Purdue rivalry, though. And that's all I will say for now, but I think you will be surprised at the number of players who did not necessarily grow up in Indiana or within the Indiana-Purdue rivalry that still felt it very, very pointedly by the time their careers were over. Begrudgingly, but we should move on. I wanted to ask you, Mike, I want to talk to you about basketball. Shifting from football to basketball. Practice was open last week. I was not there. I was still in convalescence, but you were there. First chance to get a look at this team. I think you told me maybe 1 or 2 players were out injured or sick or something. So, it's not, these things are never going to be like just a full-on window, but we know for the second summer in a row, Darian DeVries is getting more on-court time than normal because of the trip down to Peru that Indiana is going to be taking here next month. Josh Poe says no promises were made, so I'll let you two hash that out. First and foremost, just your initial impressions of what you saw. We got some time behind the scenes around the same time of year in 2025 with IU basketball. I think you could tell, and maybe we expectations rose and fell as the season went on, but you could tell kind of what type of team that was going to have to be even from pretty early on because of its size profile and its positional profile. I'm curious what your kind of initial reactions were to what you saw from an open practice setting last week with basketball.
Yeah, it's hard. Obviously, it's once again an entire new roster, and I think we've both sort of were burned last year with sort of trying to project things out and how it would look. And even as the season started, it was like, oh, this team looks pretty good. And then obviously, it's just so hard. I think one of the things you've reported on this, and Darian DeVries talked about this in terms of like what their focus was in the portal. I'm trying to maybe look like more of a Big Ten team in terms of like the size of the front court. And I think that was sort of like one of the things that jumped out. That SMU big man, Smet, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name yet, was sort of a throwback in terms of like he looks like a big that could fit really in any era. And, you don't get those very much anymore. And Indiana didn't have one and hasn't had one in a long time like that. And then you pair him up with Aiden Sherrell. I think you're going to have a real different look to Indiana basketball this year. And then obviously you kind of throw in some of the different pieces. I think you still have, you got some more athleticism. You still have some 3-point shooting. Marcus Burton. Obviously, I think, a lot of this is going to rise and fall on him in terms of like the upside he showed at Notre Dame is sort of like, the ACC's leading scorer and where he was on trajectory last year before sort of that freak ankle injury. It looks like a very different team. I think you can see the front court size is going to make a difference. But in terms of how it all comes together, obviously this was still an early practice and sort of even their off-season sort of calendar. We will see. But I do think that they it looks like Darian DeVries has learned the lessons of where this team failed last year.
Yeah, I'm curious. And again, I know it is early. I don't expect like definitive answers on this, but I'm curious from your perspective, again, if I think about a year ago, and I think we're going to have some more sort of open practice time with this group as the summer goes on. So this probably won't be the only time we visit some of these questions, through some of these summer podcasts. But if I think back to last summer when we got to see DeVries' team, you could tell very early on how much was designed around Tucker DeVries and Lamar Wilkerson. And obviously it kind of turns out that way. And I think there's some things that Indiana maybe hoped that it could do, beyond just those two players that didn't wind up really kind of developing or coming to fruition. But you mentioned the two bigs plus Marcus Burton, and I know one of the first things you texted me after the fact last week was that you felt like a lot of this was going to run through Marcus Burton. But I'm curious, like, to what extent you can sort of detect like a sort of an order of responsibility. Like, do you think the bigs are going to be the centerpiece, really, or is it maybe too early to know?
I think it's too early to know because we just didn't see enough like good on good, like 5-on-5 kind of stuff. It was, a lot of install, a lot of, sort of drill work. And so like, we weren't there yet. I think, cause I do think we saw them in July last year and they had with having a smaller amount of practices. Like, I think we saw a session last year that was more sort of scrimmage based, and you got to sort of sense that. I think they don't.
It was later in the summer too. It was like, I think mid-July as opposed to mid-June. So,
but they don't have to rush through it, right? Since they only had like 10 practices last year, they had to do a certain amount more of that because you just had less. So here they can take a lot more time with it because there's not really, from what I'm understanding, much restriction on what they can do. So like, and how much time they can spend. I think that's still to be determined. I just think when you look at sort of like the makeup of things, like when you look at the talent on the floor they have, you can kind of tell Sherrell is going to be a dynamic player, right? And he gives you a lot of options. And so I do think maybe even if they were to show us more, it'd still be harder to tell because I think they can do more this year. I don't think they have to be so like last year. Ultimately, they're going to rise and fall in the 3-point shot, right? This year, I think they can have some 3-point shooting and they can be a team that can, shoot like that in a given night, but also they can be a team that can, body a team inside now and sort of wear a team down where they didn't have any of that last year. And so I do think that it'll be interesting to see what Darian DeVries thinks the strength is ultimately and how he sort of builds things out. And what we see sort of in obviously November, because I do think he has more options this year.
Sherrell is a player that and I know I'm hardly alone. I mean, this is hardly a hot take, but one of the things that it felt like, and when we talk about basketball, modern basketball anymore, it feels like what we're talking about is options. Yeah. How many players give you different options for, what you can throw at a team defensively, what you can do yourself offensively, where you can get into your offense, where you can get your points. And it just felt like by the business end of last season, Indiana's sort of defined paths to success on the floor were just so narrow that Indiana had to score in a very defined number of ways. Indiana could only defend in a very defined number of ways. There weren't enough players on the floor. I think that the word that the NBA seems to embrace in some corners is optionality. There weren't enough players on the floor that allowed that brought optionality to the level that said, well, if we want to throw him to the corner, you're going to have to stretch your defense and tilt your defense because he can shoot threes, but he can put the ball on the floor, but he can go, he can run lobs, he can run the ball screen, all these different things. Sherrell is the sort of player that I think makes you really at both ends of the floor. And then this is why he was such a coveted transfer. I think potentially very multi-layered as a team. And, it's interesting to kind of hear you sort of talk about him in those terms, because that's certainly that was my impression of what I thought Indiana thought it was getting when it recruited him. And I think that's in a lot of ways what Indiana needs from him. It's all well and good to say, well, we recognize we needed more size. We're going to play two bigs, or we recognize that we needed more experience at the power 4 level, high major level, whatever term you want to use. So we went out and got a lot of guys that are coming from Duke and Notre Dame and Georgia Tech and Alabama and so forth, rather than guys that are coming up from the mid-major level. But functionally what you need more than anything else is just players that give you options that can't be put into a clearly defined box. And he is the one that I think is much, Marcus Burton too, to an extent, because he's got the scoring ability, but he's also got the creative ability, and he's kind of shown both at different levels at different times in his career. I think based on maybe as much as anything else, what his team needed from him at any given time at Notre Dame. But Sherrell is the player that I look at, and I just think if there's a dynamism to this team that is definitively better than it was, at a higher level than it was a year ago, that to me is the player that most likely brings it. And that to me is the one maybe gives Indiana just a different dimension.
And I think people talk a lot about, stretch of the floor, and obviously 3-point shooting is part of that. We saw him, he's got pretty good touch and feels very comfortable out there. But it goes beyond that. Like, I thought defensively almost it was just as sort of like eye-opening in terms of what he'll be able to do. Looked really comfortable guarding out at the perimeter, sort of athletic enough to challenge guards, long enough to sort of like get in passing lanes and really be disruptive. But then, like, when he was going up, you talked about being the two bigs together. They sort of separated them most of the time, just because when you have two lineups, you try to have a five. They were the sort of front court for each. And like, he looked comfortable and wasn't sort of giving much, against Smet, who is 7'2", 280 listed at.
Who might genuinely, and I don't mean like. I mean, like, he's clearly not overweight. I please don't understand. I do not say it this way. Might be the largest IU basketball player I've ever covered. Somebody asked me.
He's pretty like he's not a stick in the mud. Like, he's not like a plot.
Yeah, no
guy. Like, he's got some bounce to his step, and he like moves, and like he was.
Yeah.
Not to derail the discussion we're talking about.
But somebody asked me just like, is he the tallest IU basketball? I said, and I looked at it. I said it's 7'2", 270, 280, and then you look, like you said, at the way he moves. He might be the biggest basketball player I've ever covered here. But he can move well, and he was passes pretty good. Like, he was running the offense from the top of the key, and it looked like he had some touch and can do a lot of things. But Sherrell, my point was that, like, when they were sort of in the post together and he was defending Smet, like, he wasn't giving a ton of ground and was holding his own. And so, you talk about stretching or just versatility, optionality on defense. I think that shouldn't be understated. Just of like how versatile he can be, and how what that will do for that team to be able to like send him out at the perimeter. You're trying to guard a 3-point shooter. Like, Sherrell can be able to do that. He has the athleticism, he has the length, and that did jump out at practice. I think my next question, like, again, you can, even not knowing like specific roster numbers, you can look at the way that players' recruitments unfold, and you can sort of talk about, how did this happen, and what were the, what was kind of the buzz around this player, and who else was in for them, and so forth. And you can kind of say, these are the guys that are pretty clearly sort of top of the pyramid in terms of their importance in one way or the other, whether it's he's the guy that's running the offense, or like you said, he's the guy that, that changes the dynamic defensively, or what have you. The question I don't have is, or I don't have an answer to, and it sounds like maybe this isn't one that you got a great look at. And again, we're earlier in the calendar than we were when we saw this team a year ago, preparing for Puerto Rico. But the next question I have is just like, who are the role players in this group, and what, like, it sounds simplistic, but what roles do they play? Because it's all well and good to say, well, he's going to be a role player. It's like, okay, but the roles that he's able to fill successfully are going to define what you're able to do. If you have reliable role players that can hit threes, well, that's a specific kind of offense you can run. If you don't, you got to do something else. Especially if you're going to play two bigs, the way you construct spacing around those players is incredibly important. Like, I don't know if it jumped out anybody at you, and I apologize. I know this is one practice, and yeah. I just kind of didn't get a chance to really get a look at it. I was dozing through World Cup games, but just what, like, when you look at whether it's one of the freshmen, whether it's obviously the one returning player in Trent Sisley, whether it's some of these transfers that have come in that we can recognize are going to play meaningful minutes, we just kind of don't know exactly what Indiana is going to ask them to do yet. Do you have any sense for that? Or is, because that to me that's the bit that I just don't think you can intuit without really getting a look at this team, and maybe more of a look than we've gotten so far.
Again, since, they didn't play like really extended sessions of regular sort of 5-on-5, it's hard to say. I think you saw, and availability, we don't want to get in too much, there were a couple guys out, and so I think one of them would have answered, maybe seeing him would have answered one of those questions that you sort of listed about 3-point shooting. But I think you can sort of see that, you just sort of see Trent Sicily size wise looks more mature, looks like he's taking a little bit of a step. I think the freshmen have, rough around the edges, but I don't think you sort of saw sort of how maybe necessarily all the pieces sort of functionally kind of come together yet, or where their upside will be, just because the start and stop nature of the practice we saw. So I'd be hesitant to sort of like label anybody as anything other than to say, like, you just more saw individually, like, like Trent Sicily looks different than he did last year ago. It looks more mature, or the freshmen just look like freshmen, right? Like they stood out in the sense that, like, they're still sort of getting the speed of the game and getting ready for that. But like it was hard to say otherwise. And I'll be honest, I was focused more of sort of on those big three in terms of like, because I do think in college basketball these days, when you're sort of changing out like the role, and this is not a slight, that the role pieces are just feel like interchangeable at this point in college basketball, that like these guys are mostly going to transfer because they're looking for something different, more playing time, a fresh start. And it feels like more than ever, like those are the guys that are going to just change over year to year, right? And like you're going to rise and fall in sort of your key talent. And I think the big three this year are the guys we've kind of talked about. And I think maybe their ceiling is if like somebody mentioned Prince Moody, if like he steps up and he gives you a lot more than you anticipate, then obviously as a team, I think you're better for it. But to me, it's hard. Just like I just feel like the nature of role players has changed maybe more than anything in college basketball, just because you guys just don't carry over year to year, because it feels like they're always searching for something. And that it is harder sort of to settle in. Like even last year when you looked at it, like in the first 10 games, like we thought we had a clear definition of what the team was and what all those role players could do, and it basically changed, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the guys fell off and struggled, and Josiah Miles ended up being sort of their sixth man, where he wasn't barely even played, and so it is hard to sort of, I think, get a sense, and it's hard, I think, and maybe this not unlimited but extended practice time will help sort of DeVries get a better understanding than he had last year of what the team is and all the pieces are, because last year, obviously, I think, and injuries played a part in that too last year when they had, three guys and Nick Dorn out at times. And so it was hard, but like, I do think that's probably hard for a coach to even determine, right? When you're bringing in a whole roster of new guys.
Well, because again, your role players are determined, their impact is going to be determined first, but like it starts with your centerpieces, and then it works its way down. And so if you are going to reconstruct, and listen, Indiana's not like ripping everything up and starting completely fresh from a year ago, but there is a meaningful change of emphasis here, sort of lineup wise, in terms of what you're going to be trying to do and what you're going to be, the players whose, games and skills you're going to be trying to emphasize. So, what Indiana needed from its fourth most important player, or its fifth most important player, or its sixth most important player a year ago is different to what it is now. And so, some of what you're doing, and again, this is where like I recognize I was asking a bit of a loaded question to begin with, is those role players. You can't just say, hey, you're going to say, we're going to bring you in. We need you to defend. We need you to hit threes, or we need you to be the, sort of the second point guard, or we need you to be the kind of the third big. But specifically what you're going to ask them to do, what like their purpose is on the floor, is going to be defined in part by their relationship to the most important players on the team. And when you have turned over 12 of your I guess what is it, 11 of your 12, Indiana, I think, stopped at 12, unless I missed something somewhere along the way. But when you've turned over all but one scholarship spot, you have to figure out sort of what life looks like for the alphas first, before you can figure out exactly how to accentuate the strengths of those players with the role players behind them. What maybe those players can't do that you need somebody else to pick up the slack on, and so forth. And then also, you never know if you get a hold of, like you said, a freshman that flattens the learning curve, or maybe a player that just wasn't quite in the right situation at their previous school, but you say, hey, like we
You found a talent, an upside that they didn't show.
We
that the coaching
can
staff and you lean on last
right.
time.
I mean, like a good example from Indiana fans' perspective would be Max Bielfeldt, who goes to Michigan, can never quite stay healthy, kind of has some flashes, but just doesn't quite find a role. This was back pre-portal, but he did the old grad transfer route, came to Indiana, and Indiana was like, well, man, this guy's got great footwork. He's got all the experience of a Big Ten big, and also he can run the pick and pop game because he can hit threes. And he became Big Ten Sixth Man of the Year. But you wouldn't have known, when Max Bielfeldt committed to Indiana in May of 2015, or when I think it was in May, we all looked at that as it's help inside. It's a veteran presence from a guy who's won Big Ten titles and been to a Final Four. It's just a little bit more experience, another good voice in the locker room. We didn't have a sense for the fact that there were some elements to his game that could be unlocked by being in a different system with different teammates and a different coach and maybe some different emphases that opened up something else in his game, essentially. And that's where I almost brought up the role players question just to try and make the wider point that some of these guys, we might even get through Indiana's games in Peru and still not have a great feel for what the order of operations is for some of these guys further down, to use a football term, talking about a basketball team, the depth chart of this team. But I think it's interesting. And the last thing I wanted to ask you about basketball, and we'll probably kind of wrap up with this, but is, I know it is a limited setting, and you said maybe, that they had freshman moments and things, but your impression of those freshmen, because last year there was only one, Trent Sisley, kind of, I think was probably, showed a lot early. And then I think, maybe just sort of the season kind of wore him down, as it does freshmen over time. Those three though, four now, I guess. But I'm curious for your thoughts on any or each of them: Prince Alexander Mooney, Von Carvalho, Trevor Mannertz, or I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly, Clemens Sokolov, the 7-footer from Germany. Just if there was anything that jumped out about that freshman group to you, because it's not hard to imagine at least one of them having a role in the rotation with this team this year, possibly multiple.
Yeah, I think Moody's probably the first along, and would be the guy that if you were sort of,
and that's interesting because he was the lowest ranked of the three that signed.
Yeah,
Sokolov is a foreign, an overseas player, but Moody was, I think, the lowest ranked of the three, but played at a really high level in high school. So
yeah, he looked
athletically. So
I thought, gifted athlete, looked, I think maybe a little ahead of the curve in terms of like that grouping. And then Vaughn had a nice sort of moment. He had a like kind of thunderous dunk when he got open on a cut. But like, yeah, it's just like, freshman moments here and there. But in terms of like size, like, I mean, it is funny, like when you see Trent Sisley, how much a year in the program and like, the weight room makes a difference. Like, it'll be interesting to see too what Darian DeVries has sort of in mind for the freshmen in terms of trying to balance out getting them playing time. Because obviously, I think based on what he and Ryan Carr have said, like they don't want to turn over the roster this way every single year. Right. And so the only way to do that is by sort of developing the freshman, and B, getting them sort of in the rotation and sort of active and feeling good about their future. And so like, there is something to be said like that. You have to sort of give them a future, a glimpse of it, and maybe they're not ready, and who knows if consider redshirting or anything. But like that'll be an interesting balance because they've talked about the need to sort of balance out this roster, just as Curt Cignetti has tried to talk about. You have to sort of start that shift and sort of changing the numbers to not be so reliant on that transfer portal, and that has to start now for Indiana basketball if they want to sort of get out of this sort of this cycle that's sort of like killed them the last couple of years in terms of having to change over almost everybody. And so you have to hope at least one of them sort of steps up and you can sort of rely on it just to sort of get that process going. But like I said, it was one practice, and like I said, we'll get a couple more opportunities here. And so it'll be interesting to see if the summer things change or, the trajectories change. But for me, after the first practice, I felt if you were to say who would be the freshman to get the most playing time, early in the season, right out of the gate, Moody would be the guy, but we'll see sort of as we go here in the summer what that'll take shape.
We have a question here for someone asking, will IU grab any Michigan players with that one last scholarship spot? I have not heard anything in that regard. Have not seen any news of sort of anyone's intentions around that. There's obviously a window coming here with Dusty May leaving for the NBA where Michigan players can enter the portal. Mike Boynton, who is on Dusty May's staff, has been elevated to interim head coach. And I think, honestly, like anymore, I think that's kind of the only way you can handle those situations, because ultimately it's kind of a double-edged sword in the worst way. Like from the player's perspective, a lot of places have spent most of their money at this point, including, frankly, the place where you signed, presumably some kind of, rev share plus NIL deal already. And then from the program's perspective, if you don't, keep that, if you don't have a viable option for keeping that in-house at least for a year, if your roster comes apart in late June, you like, there's no putting it back together. You're basically punting on the next season, barring,
what was your, since you wrote about that was your return to writing about to Daily Star or writing about.
I was wondering. I was like, to Michigan basketball. I was wondering where that was going.
You're out. You're going to Ann Arbor. No, you return to the written word.
It's like the Marco Rubio memes. I'm now the coach of Michigan basketball.
What was your level of surprise about Dusty May?
I mean, I'll be honest, not that high. Like at the word in the room at the Final Four was that there were a number of NBA jobs that had the potential to come open. And because remember, the Final Four is like 2-3 weeks before the end of the NBA regular season. Word in the room then was that like there was some appeal, that there were multiple franchises that they either were open or figured they might be open. Yeah. That had some interest in Dusty May because of his profile as a coach. I mean, certainly I think some of his roster building, how much have we talked about like the new college model feels very professional in a lot of ways. Well, if you're good in that model, that's going to appeal to the NBA. And then obviously if you watch the stuff that his Michigan teams ran, I mean, like there was some stuff there that was so layered in advance that you'd be a fool if you're an NBA franchise to not at least explore it. But I don't think it was like fait accompli. It wasn't like, oh, he's already got this job, everybody knows. But like, it was clear that he was the kind of coach that the NBA had kind of identified and said, there could be appeal in a someone like that at our level, but it's also got to be the right job for him. I don't think Dusty May was going to, he's always, to my impression, been very considered and reasoned with, he didn't jump on the first thing steaming out of Florida. First of all, he took a chance on that Florida Atlantic job. That was not a good job when he took it. And then when he had some success there, he didn't jump on the first thing steaming out of Boca Raton. He waited, he bided his time. If you think back to when he took the Michigan job, he was linked to Ohio State that cycle, Louisville, Vanderbilt. Like, he was clearly very thoughtful in exploring kind of what his next step would be. And, I mean, somebody told you got to, if you were an accomplished basketball coach and somebody told you got to take Cooper Flagg, and build around him, like that's a pretty appealing. That might be more appealing than like, I don't know what other job. I can't remember what other jobs were open this cycle, but like the King's job or something where you're just constantly fighting the dysfunction or whatever. So I wasn't like shocked that he left. This is not me suggesting. No one was like calling me and being like, yeah, guess what? Like Dusty May's leaving.
You recommended him?
I hired him. Actually, I'm also in addition to being the head coach of Michigan basketball and now an accomplished author, I am the general manager of the Dallas Mavericks. And you think I can't text and podcast at the same time? You should see how.
No, I know you can text and you just know you can text. You can't podcast. You can text.
But no, like it certainly seemed like something that was a possibility even at the tail end of last basketball season. But you just never know until the situation presents itself. And the coach has to decide it's the right situation for him. And again, I don't know Dusty May personally. I'm not going to act like I do. But my impression of him from talking to people who know him from observing kind of his career, and obviously, as an IU alum, and his name has come up around here before. It's, we think we both have kind of, done our due diligence on background on Dusty May. Like, my impression has been that he has always been a very sort of careful and thoughtful coach when it comes to the decisions he makes in his career. And so I don't think it was necessarily something that was just like, hey, first chance I get, I'm gone. But it was obviously something that, held a level of appeal at the NBA level, even going back to the tail end of last season, just based on kind of what I heard, kind of when I was in more national settings. And so wasn't shocked. But listen, anytime you see something like that happen, my dad immediately texted me and was like, is this, another coach that's been driven out by NIL? And I was like, no, I think this is one where the coach, he just wanted a chance to try the NBA.
And you're never going to be, this is your chance, right? You've won the title. What do you have to,
it's kind of multiple things. It's you've won your championship. You've obviously, if he'd stayed at Michigan, he would have had carte blanche. It kind of goes without saying. But the other thing you kind of preserve here, because listen, I'm not predicting Dusty May is going to succeed or fail in the NBA. I'm not smart enough on the NBA to know that. But the other thing you kind of preserve if you're someone like Dusty May is, not unlike Nick Saban leaving LSU for Miami, you sort of like capture and amber what you were as a college coach. And so if for some reason the pros don't work out and you do wind up going back down to college, because of course Dusty May is not that old. I think he's 49 or 50 maybe. And he looks younger than me. So, I think he's going to be doing it for a while if he wants to. You also preserve that reputation for yourself. If for some reason it doesn't work, like when, this is like ever so slightly before my time, but like Rick Pitino leaves Kentucky for the Celtics, but when that doesn't work, when he goes back down to college, he's Rick Pitino that won a national title at Kentucky, right, much more so than Rick Pitino that did not have the success in Boston. When Nick Saban leaves LSU for the Dolphins, when he goes back down to Alabama, he's Nick Saban who turned Michigan State and LSU into national contenders, not Nick Saban who couldn't quite make his process and his system work in the NFL. And so you kind of preserve that part of it too, that it's like, hey, I've accomplished everything I can in college. And also, if for some reason this doesn't work out and I do wind up thinking maybe I want to come back to college someday, I come back with a certain profile. And so I think that part of it, is it just makes a lot of sense for any coach too. And again, I don't know, like Dusty May's career ambitions. Maybe he is looking at this and saying, hey, I'm never going to coach in college again. I have no idea. Like, I have absolutely no clue, but it just, to me, it makes all the sense in the world. And I think it's a tough one for Michigan sort of in the near term, but the flip side is if you're Michigan, whatever your sort of decision around, your next season and your roster and whatever else, you've also just had three separate your last three coaches have all done Elite Eight or better. Two of them have made it to national championship games. One of them won a national title. Dusty May has helped you illustrate pretty clearly what's possible at Michigan in basketball. Even at a time when I know Michigan football this year kind of got weird, but like in general, even at a time when Michigan football has been operating at a pretty high level, won a national title just 3 years ago, this is still what's possible in basketball in Michigan. There was a perception at times in John Beilein's tenure that maybe Michigan had shifted some focus, and this may have been an unfair perception anyway, but that Michigan had shifted some focus and emphasis to basketball because they were just struggling so badly in football. It's not like football hasn't had some success up there lately. And this is still what Michigan basketball is capable of. Long term, you leave that program in a pretty good place too. So
informative.
There we go. That's what we do. That's how we do it here on Mind Your Banners. And we promise we'll do it more than once a month. We'll try to be back next week. If not next week, then the week after. Again, we are going to get another look at the basketball team. There's going to be stuff to talk about with Curt Cignetti and his team as they start to build up toward the season. There's obviously going to be just all sorts of random God knows what floating around in college sports. We are hitting that point in the summer when we start talking about like litigation and congressional action and things where it does really feel like we just need to start playing some football again, just because everybody's getting bored, and that boredom is taking us to some weird places. We hope it takes you to Amazon.com or Walmart.com or Barnes & Noble, wherever you get your books, Unthinkable to Unstoppable. It is out for pre-order now. Release date, September 22nd. We'll have a lot more on that as the summer wears into the fall, but we are so excited to share that with you all today. He is Mike Niziolek. I am Zach Osterman. Thank you to everyone that joined us in the live stream today. Thank you to all of you who have listened, wherever you listen to your podcasts. I hope you're having a great summer, and we will talk to you soon.